Every day begins with a jumble of numbers.
834,000 people come forward and get a jab. 65% of our population and 35% of our population.
813 people, 126 in intensive care who require ventilation.
As New South Wales breaks yet another daily record with
1,218 cases of community transmission.
the Premier continues to accentuate the positive.
We're halfway to that magic 70% number. We are going to show the way in Australia as to how you can live with COVID.
Berejiklian is committed to opening back up when 70% of over 16s are vaccinated. But apart from a return to classrooms, there's still little detail on what that looks like.
It's probably going to depend a bit on what the number of cases look like at the time they get to 70%. And I think at this stage, that's really difficult to predict. She hasn't got a lot more levers left to pull to stop vaccination rates coming down.
Communication is increasingly under the microscope. The state no longer reporting details such as unlinked cases or how many are not in isolation. And the diminishing transparency has health experts worried.
This would be the first time that public health data wasn't shared, particularly during a pandemic.
From a communication standpoint, they're really not succeeding with those press conferences.
I feel a degree of sympathy for it. She's not in a very nice situation. I think it wouldn't hurt to be a bit clearer with the population, but we've not faced an epidemic of Delta at this level before.
Amid all this, a report this weekend claims the Premier has told colleagues she thinks Scott Morrison is evil and a bully and would prefer Peter Dutton was PM.
Do not believe what you read.
So, if she wants support in opening up, should the Premier be more open with the public?
Well, up until 3 months ago, Ihsan Vasade was Gladys Berejiklian's Director of Strategy. He's now the Deputy CEO of the Committee for Sydney, and he joins us now. Ihsan, if we go back to the start of this outbreak, it seemed like every epidemiologist was screaming at Gladys to lock down hard and fast. Can you explain why she ignored that advice?
Lisa, I don't think it's as simple as to say that she ignored that advice. I think there was plenty of advice coming to the Premier and others from health experts and other experts about restrictions. And I think experience has shown, whether it's in Victoria, whether it's in New Zealand or elsewhere, that the Delta variant is very, very hard to contain. Yes, we can absolutely have that debate whether the restrictions should have happened earlier, whether they should have been tougher restrictions, but we are now in a very, very tough lockdown, and the numbers are not really budging. So there is a question now about, do we think about our settings going forward? Is the zero strategy as kind of important as and effective as it was in 2020? I think one key challenge for us was that I think government was probably operating under 2020 settings when it should have probably reset its thinking a bit more quickly and kind of focus a bit more on vaccinations. And I think that would have come primarily from the federal government, who has only recently accepted that we are in a race. I think that has set us behind in a serious way early on. Now we're in a much better position. The community has responded in such an incredible way. We have the highest vaccination rates in terms of how we are speeding through vaccinations in the world. And that really is the answer to going forward for us to come out of this crisis.
The question was whether early on there were other voices in the Premier's ear, perhaps that were more motivated by economics rather than health issues. Is that a relationship that would have had any kind of influence or bearing on how the Premier dealt with it all in those early stages? Look,
there's all sorts of advice when you're in the Premier's office, when you're the Premier, that comes from all sorts of directions. You're right, there is conflicting advice and viewpoints from lots of people out there. But I think this whole notion that there is the separation between the economy and people's health and social welfare and mental health, I think this has been a false dichotomy throughout the whole campaign, throughout the whole pandemic, I should say. And so whether that advice existed or not, I think the right response was to suppress the outbreak as much as possible, to try and keep a lid on hospitalisations and to keep services for people going and to speed through vaccination rates.
Ihsan, this weekend an article in the Sydney Morning Herald said that Gladys has described Scott Morrison as evil and a bully. These rumours have been around for quite a while, dating back to the bushfires. We all know Gladys handled those brilliantly, the Prime Minister not so much. So does that description sound pretty close to the mark when it comes to Gladys's relationship with the PM?
Look, it's obviously not an easy couple of crises that the Premier and the Prime Minister have kind of charted together. And while I'm not going to talk about, my time in government and, people who have been quoted without putting their names to it, it is pretty obvious that the relationship at times is difficult. But I guess the Prime Minister is running the nation. The Premier is running New South Wales. It is a completely different scenario. And look, it's very hard for me as a former government staffer to speak about, relations between the federal and the state government. I'll leave that to the columnists to talk about. But yes, it's obvious that it has been a tricky situation for the country. And yes, there have been tensions.
I can see you trying to be diplomatic. We all know that there's been backgrounding going on by the Prime Minister's office against this particular Premier. Do you think the PM can be a bit of a bully?
Look, I think that's a pretty hard question for me to answer. I don't think that's
I think your face says it all, Hassan. Your face says it all.
Look, I'll give a politician's answer. I think the conversations between our leaders.
Oh God!
Can be
please don't give us a politician's answer. Please don't. We'd absolutely rather you say nothing than give us a politician's answer.
That is the whole problem.
Thanks so much for having me.
When we get politicians' answers, we don't believe them. And apart from that, we have believed you, and we really appreciate your time this evening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lisa, and everyone for having me.
With so much content online, it's sometimes hard to keep up with it all. And let's face it, who has the time? The Project YouTube has you covered with the stories that matter. Hit subscribe for a daily list of the news that you need to know.